My name's Jay Johnson. Last year, I served as the vice president for JCI, and I was honored and blessed to be assigned to the Nordics, which it's so nice to see a couple of my dear friends on here as well. This year, I'm serving as the Deputy National President for JCI USA, and it's been a very interesting year. I don't think anybody could have necessarily expected what this year would look like, but we're adapting as everybody else is, and trying to stay safe and healthy. In addition to that, I'm the CEO at Coeus Creative Group. One of my business partners has joined us today, Jennifer Mansfield. She's actually also a former JCI member from my local chapter, and has also served in a lot of different capacities in the organization up through the national level. So today we're going to talk about conflict, which is an area that I'm truly passionate about. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point in time. So should have everybody. Let me just move my little face grid over here so I can see everyone. I like to see the smiling faces. It's so nice. But we're going to talk about difficult people. And the interesting thing about this is, and now I've traveled to probably 20 different countries, and ironically enough, no matter what the culture, no matter what the country, it is still full of difficult people. And no matter where I go, there's always conflict. And that's just part of our human nature. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how our behavior as human beings ultimately drive conflict and our personal stake in conflict. So this is going to be very similar to if I was to give the dealing with difficult people training pre-COVID time, except one of the things that I've been doing is really modifying this to say, here are the tactics and how you can utilize this, either in the virtual world or things that you can take into consideration from the virtual perspective. But the irony of it all is that the behaviors that we're seeing that are creating conflicts, even in the virtual, are not dissimilar to the same conflict creators that we see in the actual, face-to-face interactions. So we'll start by our sort of overall framework, and that is behavioral intelligence. This is what our company specializes in. This is what we really focus on. And what we try to do is help empower people by helping them to learn to explain existing behavior, predict future behavior, influence other people's behavior, and then control our own behavior. And that simple model really comes from our inherent belief that behavior is a choice. We choose how we want to behave each and every decision that we make throughout the day. Sometimes we might get that feeling that we just want to scream and yell, but we don't. And that's really the difference between something like emotional intelligence and behavioral intelligence. Our emotional intelligence is about our emotional awareness and regulation and other people's emotions. Behavioral intelligence really focuses on the action, what we choose to do. So while we might feel that rush of emotions, if we're aware of it, we have a high emotional intelligence, that's going to give us a clue to say, okay, now we can choose how we want to execute our behavior. And that's where behavioral intelligence comes in. So it's founded on three basic disciplines, the discipline of communications, neuroscience, and psychology. And you're going to get to see some of that today and how that ultimately ends up functioning. So, and us and failure, and how we choose to behave every single day is ultimately what's going to be the results of us being successful in our personal and professional lives, or the results of us having setbacks or conflicts and failures. The one thing that I want to leave with you today, if you take nothing else from this talk, the one thing that I want to leave with you is, why should you have to worry about changing your habits, your behaviors in relation to conflict? And the answer to that is very, very, very simple. It's because all of you, I know most of you, have gotten to meet most of you, and ultimately at the end of the day, somebody else's bad behavior is not worth your own heart attack. And when we get into conflict situations, whether it's from stress or anything else, and we'll talk a little bit about those, the thing that we need to remember is that those stresses, those impacts, those conflicts, they have devastating consequences both on us individually, like our health, but it also has devastating consequences for the organizations that we're a part of or the teams that we're working within. So let's talk a little bit about the brain science behind this real quick. One of the things that I always talk about is the limbic system, and that is our fight, flight, or faint response. And when we look at the limbic system and what it does, one of the key parts of it is the amygdala, and that's that fear regulation center. So whenever we're afraid, so imagine yourself walking down an unfamiliar street and you have to turn into an alley because there's a roadblock and it's dark and it's creepy and you're just kind of looking around, you're on high alert and you're looking around to make sure that there's no dangers around these corners or anything else. That is an example of your amygdala just being on high alert. Now, it's always running like that in the background. When we find ourselves in a threatening situation, three different chemicals are really released into the body, and that's adrenaline. So that is something that kind of pumps us up and moves us, gives us the ability to run faster and lift things that are heavier than we would normally do. So that chemical is really just a power chemical. Norepinephrine, and then also the last one is cortisol. And that one's the really critical one because when we're in a conflict, our body floods with cortisol. And what cortisol does is it actually dampens internal elements of our body. So for example, we get super stressed out over something. We're anxious, we're upset, we're angry, we're frustrated. This cortisol is coming into our system. And what it does is it slows down your metabolism. Why? Because you don't need to be digesting food when you're worried about flying or fighting. Okay, so it actually stops those systems. It also stops things like our immune system. It reduces the effectiveness of our immune system, and it diverts all of that energy into either fight or flight. So this comes from our evolution when we were running away from the lions on the prairies, the lions chasing us, and we don't need to be digesting our food. We don't want to be digested. We don't need to be worrying about the immune system immediately. We also, cortisol dampens our thought process. So it actually has the ability to reduce our effectiveness in making decisions and reduce our effectiveness of thinking logically. We don't need mathematical computations when we're running away from the lion. We just need to run away from the lion. This is demonstrated if you've ever been in an argument with somebody and you're going back and forth and you're fighting and finally you're like, I'm done with this argument. I'm just going to walk away from here. And you start to walk away, you get about 10 feet away and you're like, oh, damn it, I should have said this. I would have really gotten them if I said this. That's the transition from the limbic system, the limbic brain, to our more rational, logical thinking brain, the neocortex. We also see this in elements where we might be in an argument with somebody and we walk away and we get away from the argument. We start thinking about it and going back to it. And all of a sudden, wait a second, this didn't make sense. Why did I do this? And we start analyzing that. That's the transition of our limbic reactions to our more thoughtful, executive center decision making and logic. So that's really kind of the precursor. We live in this world of threat, anxiety, and conflict every single day. And that limbic system is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's always running in the background. So one of the things that we need to think about is, okay, well, what is triggering some of those different limbic reactions? What are the things that we do or interact with each other that causes that? So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and open up the chat box. And I'd like to hear from you what you think. We'll go to here. What do you think are some of the major causes of conflict? So go ahead and chat it out with me. We're going to do a little interactive, some different engagement activities and things like that. But I'm curious from you, what are tone of voice? Absolutely. That can be a huge one. If something's taken out of tone, yep. Assumptions, misunderstandings, confusion, certainly. Yep, there's some other ones out there. What are some other ones that you would notice or think about in terms of causes of conflict? Put you to the test. Poor communication, very good, yep. Fear, absolutely. So we know that all of these can ultimately drive conflict, but when we're thinking personal agendas, most certainly. We've seen those occur in different organizations, I'm sure, that we've been in. When we think about this, we have to think about it not just from our own perspective, right? We have to think about it from the perspective of sort of the team dynamics, the culture, the way that we interact with each other. So use of chat when discussing important issues instead of properly conversing. I can definitely see that one too, because you do lose a lot of that tone or that body language. Personal agendas realized. Zoom on iPad, no worries, no worries. So this is, there's a lot of different causes of conflict, and there's some major ones that were not even necessarily demonstrated there. Like, for example, financial resources is a huge driver of conflict. Interpersonal resources, how much time we have to spend with people, huge driver of conflict. And ultimately, like, if we take those two things and be like, well, how can financial resources be a driver of conflict? Well, if you've ever been in a situation where you and a colleague have the same job and you're paid the same wage, but you do way better work or do way more work, and all of a sudden there's a tension there, you're going to find it. Language barriers, absolutely. Importance of tasks, absolutely. All of these things, right? So we need to think about those, because a lot of times when we look at these different causes of conflict, it's because there's an us versus them. And when we think about that us versus them dichotomy, it's our financial resources, our understanding of situations, our language versus their language, or our tone versus their tone, our drive versus their drive. We naturally, human beings, have this natural capacity to see the world perspective. And that's what leads in a lot of cases to things like a cognitive bias. So there's a really interesting, I'm going to give you an example of this, a really interesting cognitive bias that we have is that we feel like we are better or more capable than a lot of the people in the outside world. And this is done in this study. And what they did was they brought these people in and they had them execute a puzzle. And as they started to execute this puzzle and they were successful in the execution of the puzzle, the researchers went to them and said, wow, that's incredible. You did such a great job on this puzzle. I mean, I can't believe you were able to solve this puzzle. It was amazing. And then they asked them, do you think that your friends or your coworkers or colleagues would be able to solve this puzzle? And overwhelmingly, people said, no, I don't think that they would. So as they're testing the coworkers, colleagues, and they solve the puzzle, they asked them, do you think your other colleagues would be able to solve this? No, this is, this is something, it's just a fascinating cognitive bias we have, is a duality where we feel that we're in control and successful and that other people may not be, or they may not be equipped for it. Well, that goes two ways. And now all of a sudden we have this us versus them bias about us, okay? So let's talk about some of the major drivers of stress that we're seeing in this COVID time. And quite frankly, these are also major drivers of conflict, even outside of this, but we're seeing them definitely hyper personified now. One of those is stress. Ugh, so much stress. Now, when we're thinking about stress, you can be thinking about things of isolation, creating sort of a stressful environment. You can think about the stresses of being locked inside, the stresses of all of the pain points of the changing in behaviors. So when we change a behavior, or when we structurally have to do something different, there's a cognitive process that happens inside of us. So for example, when we think about if we wanted to start exercising, say we're not exercising and we want to start exercising, our brain will actually make justifications for why we can do it tomorrow or next week or anything else. We try to avoid it. And our motivational patterns are to go towards pleasure and away from pain. And the brain is very, very good at rewarding avoiding pain. This is a lot of times why in conflict situations, we avoid having a discussion, or we avoid engaging, or sometimes people miss work because of conflict. They'll avoid projects because of conflict, because the brain is saying, let's not deal with that. We don't need to deal with that. That's painful. and we are more motivated towards pleasure. So the stress of this environment, we've had to change things like the way that we shop, the way that we interact, the way that we communicate, and all of those different elements in place has forced us to actually change our behaviors. Now, in that environment, when we're doing all of those different behavioral changes, it can get incredibly stressful. And you see the acronym up there, HALT. Does anybody raise a hand heard the acronym HALT, what that means in the psychological circles? Okay, so that is an acronym for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Any of those four states at any point in time massively increases that limbic reaction that I was talking about. If you are hungry, and if any of you have ever experienced being hangry, where it's like, oh my God, I haven't eaten and now I'm ready to bite somebody's head off, that's an example of this, okay? So when we feel hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, that mental set of being causes us to lash out, causes us to do transference. So we will actually take our own stress and lay it upon people. And oftentimes it's the people that we have the most interactions with or that we love the most, which is really a messed up aspect of human behavior, but it is something that's pretty common. So stress. The other thing that is creating a whole lot of conflict right now is beliefs and our understanding of the world. So we have a lot of misinformation out there. We have a lot of accurate information out there, and it's very, very difficult to sort that out. But ultimately, what our beliefs or our standpoints are litmus cases for conflict. So if somebody thinks that this is dumb and I can't believe that we have to do this versus somebody that's super cautious and says that we need to follow all of these restriction and guidelines, that's actually going to have an impact. Now, once you identify those beliefs, you have automatically created an us versus them. That label, that natural label that our brain does, is something that also contributes to conflicts that are not related to those beliefs. Let me give you an example. If you are if you say you and somebody that you find to be a difficult person, if you look back and trace back, more than likely one of the things that you will find early is an instance of where they were on one side of an argument and you were on the other, or one side of a belief and you were on the other. These labels are all types of things, and I know that this sounds really interesting, but the fact that you are JCI Malta and I am JCI USA creates a division between us rather than we're all JCI. And as soon as we label somebody as different, we lose an element of being able to connect with them and let from our limbic system. In our logical, rational thinking executive brain, we look and say diversity is a great thing. You know, it's awesome that we can connect with each other and we're all part of this larger JCI. But unfortunately, that limbic system's pretty powerful. And the moment that we start labeling somebody as difficult or challenging or anything else, we start to behave towards them in a different way. That's also true with beliefs. It's also true with values. So, and I'm going to give you an example of value. When I first started in the university, I was on the debate team, and I went to my very first tournament. And when I went to this tournament, I was accompanied by two coaches. I'm going to change their names to protect the innocent or guilty, however you want to look at it. We're going to call them Dick and Stacy. Okay. And Stacy was a very, very staunch, and I didn't even know what feminism was at this point in time. So I'm going to preface that. I was a dumb hockey player. I played hockey for 18 years, and I was not educated at this point. And Stacy was a very, very staunch feminist. And we went to the tournament and we flew into the airport. And this is like one of my first times flying and everything else. Like, so just to give you an idea of where 18-year-old Jay Johnson is not the person that you're looking at today. And we go to the airport and we land. And as we're standing there, Stacy's bag starts coming down the conveyor belt. And now Stacy's bag is like this big by this tall, and it's super heavy. I mean, it's bigger than she is. And she's a very petite woman, and she reaches down to grab the bag, and the bag starts pulling her down the way. And I see this, and I'm standing there, and I reach down, and I pick up her bag, and I pull it off the conveyor, and I set it down. And the next thing that happened, I had no idea, because she turned and she started screaming at me. Like, who the hell do you think you are? I don't need your help. And I'm taken aback. I'm completely confused by this. I was just trying to be nice. And I heard in the back of my head the voice of my mother saying, if you don't help this woman, I will slap the taste out of your mouth. And the voice in the back of her head was different, though. It was every single time that somebody told her, you need a man in your life. You can't make it out there by yourself. You're not strong enough. You're not good enough. Now, that voice in the back of her head is no more right or wrong than the voice in the back of my head. Could she have maybe handled that different and educated me in a different way that maybe I would have understood and not been traumatized, and like years later finally figured out and be like, oh, this makes sense? Of course, right? And there's different ways that we can approach that, but I understand that her value system at that point in time was maybe misaligned with my value system. We could have had a really good dialogue about that, maybe understood each other better. But again, that's the limbic system, that's the fight or flight, rather than taking the step back and understanding, why did I do that versus why did she do that? Does that make sense? Everybody with? Excellent. This is also something that we see, the values that we have, whether it's the values of I prefer face-to-face communication via text communication. Those are value systems. Those are communication value systems. Whether I prefer to lead or whether I prefer to follow, these types of narratives that are playing in the background, especially during this time, are driving some of our behaviors and are driving some of the ways that we interact with people from around the world on Zoom or via email or anywhere else that we're having those communications. The final one that I'm going to talk about in terms of this is communication. We all know that body language and tone and inflection are a critical aspect of our communications. And a lot of times, and I saw that in there in the tones, the misunderstandings, and all of these different things, that is a function of communication. I might have a very innocent and adaptive intent behind saying something. But if we're at odds and it's us versus them, I'll give you an example of this. And it's kind of a crude example, so forgive me here. If you've ever been sitting around a campfire and you've had a colleague that was sitting next to you and a very, very good friend, and for some reason they felt it was appropriate to just fart. And you started laughing and you're like, oh my gosh, you're so gross. What's wrong with you? And you laugh. But then, my gosh, if you were sitting in the office and it was somebody that you viewed as an enemy accidentally farted as they walked by, you would be like, you sick son of a, you intentionally did this to ruin my day. I use that as the crude example because the behaviors are the same, but we're willing to forgive the communications of one person, and we're not necessarily willing to forgive the communications of another, depending on how we understand our label with that person. So in this case, when somebody says something, a friend says something, and a foe says something, they could be the exact same communications, and we are going to experience those communications differently. The way that we communicate, our behaviors in communication, are going to be accepted in a completely different way. So when we think about our communication styles, communication is this is really sad to me because I have a master's in communication. I have another graduate degree in health communications, and I studied that first, only to find out that communication is a truly flawed system. Which is why I went back and started to study psychology and neuroscience and everything else to try to get, yes, a fart is communication. There is a message attached with it, just so you know. If you take nothing else away, besides it's your heart attack, maybe that's the second lesson here for you. You know what you get when you get Jay Johnson talking. Actually, you never know what you're going to get. So let's look at some of these behaviors that we have and that we exhibit, because these are all different behavioral archetypes. We see them inside of COVID. We see them outside of COVID. But these are different things to think about. Now, one of the things that I'm producing this year is an actual handbook on how to address these behaviors from your own personal behavioral style. So how do we think about these behaviors, and then how do we react to them? I'm going to share these slides with you so you don't have to write all of these things down. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly because I want to get to the solutions aspect and like what we can do to fix. So we're just going to talk about them very, very briefly. There's a lot of them. These are different archetypes, and these are people and labels that we ultimately end up using to create that us and them dichotomy. So the not listener, this is the person that avoids your phone calls. This is the person that you might be talking to them and they're watching TV and they, huh, what'd you say? And you're like, I swear to God, why are you not listening to what I'm saying? Or I told you this 7 times and you still have not. That's an example of the not listener. The curmudgeon. This is the person that's always going to be like, well, back in my day, this is how we used to do it. And, you know, there's never going to change and blah, 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 blah. And you hear that sort of narrative come out of the person that has the experience and the knowledge kind of killing some innovation. The negator. This is the person that just flat out says no to everything. It's almost like they get paid every time that no comes out of their mouth. This is somebody who can be very frustrating and create a very challenging situation for us. The bully, this is the person who's intentionally going to try to intimidate you or intentionally try to sabotage you just because they don't like you or you have that kind of interaction with them. The martyr, this is the person that drives me the most insane. This is like my personal, like my difficult person is the martyr. And that's the person who will say, for example, run around and try to do everything. And as they try to do everything, they'll come back to you and then be like, oh, I have to do everything around here, but I do it because I love you. And it's just like, oh, either do it or don't, but don't necessarily make yourself out to be that, you know, high and mighty martyr. The manipulator is the person that's going to be tweaking things here or there or kind of pulling the strings and, you know, just doing those little things to give themselves an advantage or to take somebody down or to put somebody down. They're going to manipulate behind the scenes most often. They're not going to necessarily be direct in their confrontation. They're going to be a little passive aggressive. The blame shifter, this is the person that will never take accountability. So if you're working on a project team and it's just like, hey, where's your assignment? It's like, oh, well, I didn't get that done because, and they immediately start to shift the blame into other aspects of the team, or they shift it onto the weather or anything else. But there's no accountability to be like, you know what? I didn't do it. Didn't have it in me today. Sorry, I let you down. I'll get back after that and I'll get right on it right away. But there's always going to be some other reason, not necessarily them. The gossip. This is the person that's going to walk around and just share. And by the way, gossip inside of a crisis, when we're talking about like managing crisis, gossip is actually one of the behaviors that exponentially increases. Whispers, gossips, and everything else inside of small units as well as like larger units. Part of the reason is because we don't like uncertainty. The brain, that's painful to the brain. Uncertainty is painful, so we fill it in with other things. And when we don't know something, did you hear what Yenny was talking about the other day? And we try to, you know, all of a sudden share this information. If you've ever said something like, okay, listen, don't tell them that I told you, you've probably started a gossip. Or I'm not supposed to say anything. Guess what? You've probably fallen into this. So if you've heard those kind of communication styles. The snark, and I learned this last year that I have to translate snark because it doesn't necessarily always translate. Smartass. And that's the look on a smartass's face when they say something smartass, and then they get that kind of look on their face because they feel like they're so clever, and you just kind of want to smack that look right off of them. Exaggerator is the person to be like, oh my gosh, I am doing so much every single day. And like, you're kind of looking at what their output is and you're like, dude, you have literally not turned in an assignment in 15 weeks. But I'm sure you're working hard. This is the one upper. So everything that you say, they have to one up. So if you're like, yeah, you know, I've got this great idea for a project, they're going to be like, oh, I've got a better idea for a project. Or if you're the person that's like, I think we can try this, and be like, you know what, that would be so okay, but here's a better way to do this. And it's always got to be one above you. And they're going to place their ego kind of higher and higher. This is the oversharer. This is that person that likes to necessarily tell you way too much information and has zero filter from here to here. And they just randomly blurt things out that it's like, probably didn't need to know that from you. Didn't need to know that from you at all. The director, this is the person that's going to tell you everything that you should be doing or how you should be doing it or how you should be behaving, but doesn't necessarily exhibit those behaviors themselves. This is like the antithesis of leading by example. They sit in a chair and direct, but they don't necessarily do. The socializer, this is the person that just loves, so this will make your meetings go longer. This person also is in the normal world, and Jen can attest to this. She was part of the community gardens that we did. There was people that we would go out and we're all digging trenches and we're building these community gardens. We're nailing boards together. We're digging. We're putting our hands in the dirt. And there was people that would just walk kind of subtly from group to group and just, hey guys, how's it going? Yeah. Oh, how was your weekend? And it's just like, we're like literally in the middle of working right now. They come over and socialize, which maybe is not so bad, but like when all of the work is done, they're like, can I help with something? Do you have I'd love to help. And it's like, seriously, you've been talking for the last 2 hours and while we've been digging. That's the socializer, going to be a little bit more social. The dodger, this is the person that every time you ask them to do something, they're going to kind of dodge it just a little bit. Be like, so Jay, could you maybe help us out in this project? And instead of me being like, yeah, sure, I'd be like, you know what? I would love to do that. But Heidi is so much better at this. Just go ahead and let Heidi take care of that because she's going to be so good. And just kind of always dodging these different responsibilities. The opinionated constantly has to share their opinion, even when their opinion is not warranted, even when their opinion is not necessary. The philosopher, this is the person that also makes your meetings last way too long because you could be talking about something as simple as like, hey, let's all go to lunch. And everybody makes agreement. Yes, we're going to lunch. And the philosopher is going to be the last person. They're going to raise their hand and they're going to be like, okay, so what is lunch? Is lunch defined by the food that we eat? Or is it defined by the time of day that we eat it? And it's just like, well, what does it matter? Like, we've already made this decision, but they want to philosophize about all of these different things that are probably unnecessary. This is the gimme pig. The gimme pig is the person that always wants more. They're just going to be like, gimme, 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 gimme. You give them something and they're going to ask for more. This is like if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for the glass of milk, and then he's going to ask for your napkin and your cars, your keys, your wallet, your credit card, your identity. That's the gimme pig. They're always going to be looking for as much as they can take. The negotiator, and yes, those are children, best negotiators ever. I actually just recently watched a negotiation between my brother and my nephew, where my nephew literally said to him, like, listen, Dad, I know that 9 o'clock is my bedtime, and I am totally willing to go to bed at like 9:30, and here's what I'll do in return. I will get up tomorrow and not complain. That is a brilliant negotiation strategy. Brilliant, but they're always going to be looking for a bigger, better deal. They're going to be looking to get the best out of it. The constant contact, this is the person that you get a text from, and as you start to respond to the text, you get a second text, and you're like, okay, I'm trying to respond to that. Then you get an email, and then you get another text, and then you get a phone call. And if they haven't done that, they're knocking at your door or at your cubicle. And they're like, I texted you, I emailed you, I called you. Are you ignoring me? Are you avoiding me? And it's just like, that all occurred in 7 minutes. Give me a half a second. And they will constantly contact you. And then we have the oddball. This is sort of that catch-all area, right? This is that I'm not 100% sure why they thought that was a good idea. Usually there's a good explanation behind things, but the oddballs are catch-all, right? Now, I can read your mind. As we were going through this, you were probably identifying different people on your teams or different people that you interact with and going, hey, that is just like Joe, or that is just like, guess what? So this is our behavioral intelligence model. We all are every single one of those people. And sometimes we don't even know that we're some of those people. But let's think about that, right? If I can predict all of those behaviors, or if I can design these different behavioral archetypes, that means that they exist. That means that they exist out there. And we sometimes are those people to other people that we don't even realize it. I'm going to give you a great example of that. But I am a person that says, all right, we can talk about the problems all day long, but the most important thing is, how do we resolve them? How can we reduce these impacts, especially even now? And the reality is our strategies for interacting with people really start with us, and it's on us. And the reason is because of two things. Number one, it's our heart attack. And having these interactions with people, somebody else's bad behavior shouldn't be ours. But number two, understanding this, and once you're introduced to these different elements, these frameworks that people exist in, it gives us the opportunity to then influence them, or at worst, control our own behavior. So we're going to talk about some of those strategies. Does anybody have any questions at this point in time on any of those archetypes or any of the causes of conflicts? I'll wait and see if anybody wants to open up or any questions before we get into the meat of it. All right, so our behavioral intelligence model in action. First thing that we need to do is we need to explain the existing behaviors, okay? We really want to take a look and say, why is this occurring? How is this going? So we are going to try to start at 11. Yeah, see, perfect. We are going to try to understand or explain the unexplainable. The first thing that we're going to do is what we call a behavioral analysis. And you can do this even in the instances of COVID times. So what I'm going to ask you to do is grab a piece of paper and a pen, just something to write on, and I will walk us through this next set of exercises. All right, so I'll give you a half a second to do so. The very first part that we're going to do, and here, let's pull up our whiteboard. All right. So what I want you to do with your piece of paper is draw a line right down the middle of it. And by the way, my handwriting in real life is just absolutely atrocious. Now, you take that and add the digital element to it. Please don't judge me by my handwriting. I speak for a living. So on your paper, draw a line here. On one side, I want you to, oh, that's not a J. That's not a J at all. This is supposed to be my name, by the way. So you're going to write your name on one side. And then what I want you to do is I want you to think about somebody that is a difficult person to you. And whoever that person is, you can write their name on this side. Now, if that difficult person happens to live with you and they might walk by your piece of paper, make up a name, use something different. We don't want to necessarily start that conversation, but so we'll just put somebody else's name in there, all right? But you have you and the other person. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is on one side, we're going to start with, come on text, here we go. On the other side, I'm going to give you a moment to do this, but I want you to list out all the behaviors that that person exhibits that drives you nuts. Now, before you start, bond is a jerk face, is not a behavior, okay? Bond is disrespectful to me in a meeting. Bond always interrupts me. Bond doesn't listen when I give directions. Those are behaviors, right? We're going to go on to the behavioral aspect, not the label. So it's what they do or it's how they act. It's not how they are as a person, all right? So go ahead and take a few, and I want you to list out as many as you can. And remember some of those archetypes, right? Like that could be gimme pig, or they could be not listener. However you want to look at that, as many of those, write down that category. So I'll give you a second to go ahead and wrap up where you're at. And I know sometimes it can be like writing a novel or War and Peace of all of the behaviors that the person's that's difficult to us. And it's okay. You can always go back to this. I want to teach you the tool and I'll give you the example. So that's part one of our behavioral analysis. Part number two, as you can probably guess, is we're going to come over here on this side to our own section of this paper. And what I'd like you to do, and this is an exercise of empathy, I want you to imagine yourself in the position of whoever that difficult person is. And I want you to really think through and say, what are the behaviors that I exhibit that would drive them insane? Now, one of the challenges here, and this is where that brain protects us, okay? This is where the brain says, I don't want to experience pain. I might say, well, Bond is just jealous of me because I'm awesome. That's not what I'm looking for here. The other thing that the brain does is if I say, well, maybe it's because I intimidate Bond, there's going to be another little voice that comes out and goes, yeah, but I do all of these things right. And I try to make sure that I'm accessible for everybody else. Don't listen to that voice right now. That voice isn't important. We'll get back to it. No one's going to see this piece of paper but you. You don't have to share it with anybody. I want you to really get into that sort of self-awareness and say, what are the things that I do that probably drive that person absolutely crazy? Okay. And we're going to write down those elements on that side of the paper. Okay. So as you start to do this, now I'm going to share a secret with you. When I do this exercise in like a large group face to face, one of the things that I do is I monitor and track all the participants' body language. And what I look for is for them to stop writing or them to look up or to be thinking or to really kind of get in there. And what I watch for is when half of the room, at least approximately, it's not like I'm, taking numbers, but approximately half of the room, when they make eye contact with me and sort of give me that signal that they're done. It doesn't work quite as well in the Zoom world, but in the face-to-face world, what we end up finding is the amount of time that it takes for people to run out of things to say when it's talking about the other person is usually about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. And then when it's reflecting on our own bad behaviors, it's only about a minute and a half at best. It is so much easier to see the other person's faults, but not necessarily get into our own. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind when we're looking at this is, and we'll get to the part 3 of this analysis here in just a second. It doesn't have to be, when we think of behavior, a lot of times we say good habits, bad habits, good behaviors, bad behaviors. I want you to try to let go of that idea. There are no good behaviors or bad behaviors. There are adaptive behaviors or maladaptive behaviors. There are behaviors that have positive outcomes. There are behaviors that have less than positive outcomes. Behaviors have consequences, but when we label something good or bad, we completely negate the opposite side of it. So let me give you an example. Snacking, okay? Some people say, oh, gosh, I have such a bad habit of snacking, especially snacking late at night. And what ultimately ends up happening is that they feel guilty because of that snacking. And when we start to feel guilty, that creates stress. And when we get stressed, the brain pushes us to do things that are comfortable, like snacking. When we start to feel guilty because of a bad behavior, because we've labeled it a bad behavior, the thing that we forget is snacking in that instance reduces my anxiety. So the behavior is neither good nor bad. It is having a positive impact of reducing my anxiety. It's having a negative impact of me gaining weight. It's just about the consequences of the behavior. Now, if we look at it in that direction, we can say, what else could I do to reduce my anxiety that would have that positive consequence and not the negative consequence that I want to avoid? But if we start feeling guilty about a good behavior or a bad behavior, that's that labeling aspect that ultimately ends up recreating those patterns of behavior. So let's go on to part 3. What I want you to do is take a look at your 2 different lists here. And what I want you to think about is, how does your behaviors interact with them? So when I look at something and I say, maybe I speak up against their ideas, well, when I do that, guess what? That leads to that behavior that really drives me insane. They interrupt me when I'm doing this, if I'm speaking against them. So that's a two-way street. Or if I look at it and say, they don't listen, well, maybe they didn't listen because I told them to wait or to pause or anything else. So now they've shut down and completely gone off. Looking at your list can you see where there's interactions between these behaviors? Because those are the places that we can put in an influence measure or a change in our own behavior that may have an impact on how they react to us. We can't control their behavior, but we can influence it by controlling our own. So take a look at your list, and where did those flashpoints kick up? Where do those conflicts start to occur at the micro behavioral level? I'm going to give you an example of this and sort of draw this out. One of the clients that I work with is a big Fortune 500 company, and we do coaching for them. And two of their management people in different divisions are responsible for working together in order to get to launch. And if you have any experience in the automotive industry or in the manufacturing industry, when you're launching a project or launching a product, every day that you're missing your launch date, you are losing millions and millions of dollars, okay? So they have had 2 launches that were delayed because these 2 people could not get to connect with each other. So I'm going to stop sharing this here as we go into, I'm going to go back to my other. There we go. So we've gone through part 1, part 2, and part 3. Now, meet Bill and Jim. Again, the names have been changed to protect the innocent and or guilty. But Bill and Jim were constantly at each other's throats. Now, each of them oversaw a division of probably anywhere between 40 and 60 people. And ultimately, both of these people are high level management. I mean, you're talking 6-figure salaries. They're each making in a range of about $200-some-thousand a year, and they have a lot of responsibilities. They're, towards the executive side of the organization. From what I was told is they were both about to be fired because they had missed their deadlines on this. So this is a desperate situation, and they asked me to come in and say, can you fix this? I said, I don't know. Let me at least listen to them and hear their story. So I had an interview with each of them at 15 minutes. And I asked, so what's going on? Tell me everything about it. And I hear the story come from Bill, and then I hear the story come from Jim. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This is so easy. They see it as easy. They saw it as $1 million problem. But I asked Bill and I asked Jim, I said, listen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home and I want you to write out, I want you to type this out, send it to me in an email, but I want you to imagine, you're sending it to your bosses. So I'm not going to send it to your bosses, but I want you to send it to me as though, communicate the situation that you just communicated to me. Is that good? And they're like, yeah, fine, no problem. So they go back and I get these emails. I print them out. I take Bill's email and I put it in an envelope labeled Jim. I take Jim's email and I put it into an envelope labeled Bill, and I call them both in. Now, when I'm doing mediation, a lot of times, especially coaching, you don't have 2 conflicting parties come in at the same time, but desperate times call for desperate measures. They're going to get fired. The organization's losing millions. It's time to go as hard as we can at this. So I bring them both in, and they're immediately, like when they see each other in there, like I can feel this tenseness, this reserved, this covering up, and all of this other thing. And I'm sitting there and like in my mind, I'm smiling. I'm like, I cannot wait for them to see this. I slid each of them the name, they're basically the opposite person's communication. I slide it over to them. I ask them to open the envelope and I ask them to read it. And as they're sitting there and they're reading it and they're looking at it, and I'm watching their faces change. I'm watching literally like the aha moments happening. And as they get through it, you see them kind of look at each other, and it looked like Lady and the Tramp when the 2 are eating spaghetti and they look at each other for the first time, and it's like, oh, I see you, like you were there. And it was such a transformational moment. So I took excerpts of those different things, and I'm going to show them to you here. You can read them. I'll read them out loud, but normally I don't read them out loud, but welcome to Zoom world. So Jim's perspective was, I can't stand Bill. He's always coming to my office, asking questions, interrupting my work, and making me late for my deadlines. If I close my door, he calls. If I don't answer, he emails. He is such a constant contact, I can't get any work done. Bill's perspective, I just don't understand Jim. I feel like he doesn't care about teamwork. He doesn't care about anyone else in the office. I know he's been there for years and has a lot of experience, which is probably why our manager tells us to go and ask his counsel when we're stuck on a problem. I just feel Jim can't be bothered and doesn't listen at all to his colleagues. Doesn't he realize blowing us off makes us not able to perform our jobs? I'm thinking I may have to go to the manager and say something about Jim's refusal to help. Two very different perspectives of the exact same situation. Unfortunately, Jim and Bill would have never come to the conclusion that we so easily implemented to fix this situation because they couldn't see the behaviors on the other side in a different perspective. They couldn't see where their behaviors were creating conflict. So what did we do? We created a stoplight and we put it on Jim's door. The stoplight was green. Come on in, ask your questions. If the stoplight was yellow, make sure that it's really important. If you're interrupting me, I might be in the middle of something. And then if the stoplight's red, not right now, I'm in the middle of something important. And then we just set terms of how long of the day is red, how long of the day is yellow, how long of the day is green. All of a sudden, the two divisions started working together. They saw each other in a different light. They saw the positive. They would have never gotten there if not for something like a behavioral analysis. So hopefully you can use this tool to really try to understand that other person's behavior. If you can understand it, then you can influence it. And maybe you can see their perspective and say, okay, I can see where these flashpoints are occurring. Here's how I can change my behavior. Make sense? I love this tool. This tool has helped me in so many different ways. All right, asking questions. Now, this is a way to get information. It's also a way to influence. But the problem is most of the time we ask the worst possible questions. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of, psychologically speaking, disarming questions, or questions that will reduce any kind of conflict or any kind of wall that somebody has. First one, I really want to help here. Would it be okay to ask a few more questions? I'm going to ask you to open up your microphones here real quick. Let's have a conversation about these, because there is some deep-seated psychology and psychological hacks that are in these questions. And I want to see what you think. What is the psychology of asking, would it be okay to answer a few more questions? The reason I love this question is, if you've ever been in a situation where somebody has approached you and says, we need to talk, and immediately what you go is, the wall comes up. I don't have time right now. I can't do this right now, or whatever else, but you're going to create a defensive barrier. So there's a concept called the illusion of control. When I come up directly and block you in and say, we need to talk, you have lost your entire sense of autonomy. You've lost control because I have now dominated you. And you may be looking at me as the behavioral archetype of a bully. Now, I may be perceiving myself as coming in as a coach, but that's not how they're going to perceive that. However, if I ask, would it be okay to ask a few more questions? I'm giving the illusion of control. I'm giving them the opportunity to say, yes, now I've chosen to engage in this conversation rather than being forced to engage in this conversation. The other psychological aspect of this, and this has been proven tons of times, and there's a great author named Robert Cialdini who talks about getting to yes. And when you get somebody to make a small commitment, a yes, the next small commitment is a little easier. And then the next one's a little easier. Getting them in a positive yes mindset opens up the door for collaboration. So very powerful, simple question, very powerful question. Second one, how can I make this process easier? This is something that you can actually look. His name is Chris Voss. He was one of the top international hostage negotiators in the entire world. This guy was called in for all of the major ones. And one of the things that he talks about is how questions, that they are so powerful in a different way, because what it does is it asks the person to open up their mind to a solution. How might I do this? How can I make this? And taking the responsibility reduces the limbic stress on the other person. But now they have to come up with a solution that you would be able to behave. And again, they have that illusion of control. Third question, what's the best case scenario for us to resolve this comfortably? This one is one of those situations where we think about things like Independence Day or even COVID. Together is better, right? We're on the same team. What's the best case for us to resolve this comfortably? How can we together fight the injustice that's out there, the conflict that's out there, okay? So I talk about these in the face-to-face world, but let's look at this and how would you use these in COVID times? These are very, very easily translatable into an email format. These are easily translatable into the text message. And it's even easier if you want to say, I really want to help here. Maybe we could hop on a Zoom call if it would be okay that I could ask a few more questions. And you integrate whatever platform that you want. Now, my recommendation on these questions is to try to get to this place where you have that ability to have a little of the face-to-face interaction where you can read facial expression, body language a little bit. You can see if somebody pulls back or if they lean into their camera, if their brow furls, or all of those other behavioral indicators of how they're feeling or what their mental state is. Texts are a great way to start maybe some of the conversation because it's a little more anonymous, it's a little safer, but at the same time, engaging in a deep philosophical conversation about conflict in this time, it is going to be a little bit better if you have a larger aspect. And if you can't do something where you have the face-to-face or the Zoom, even hearing the voice and the tone and inflection. There's points and times when I have sent communications to some different people that I work with or different teammates that I will put in the message, I have no negative tone here. This is just a question. I want to be clear. Actually putting that in there is, this is not an attack. This is not an accusation. Oh my gosh, I'm writing my tone into an email or a text. Yes, yes, I am. That clarity, that intent is huge in this environment because people are already on high alert. So if you say, would it be okay to ask a few more questions? That's why something like, I really want to help here precedes that. I'm giving you what my intention is. Behavior and intention is much like a turn signal in a vehicle, right? I turn on the turn, if I'm driving and then I whip over into the next lane, and then I turn on the turn signal, not effective. That's kind of like announcing your intentions in those text worlds, especially now, is turning on your turn signal before you move into their lane. Because once you move into their lane and then saying, oh, I didn't mean that, or, oh, that wasn't my intention, it's too late. They have already took that, intention and made it their own. If they don't know, they'll fill it in with the worst case scenario. Once we get through this, we can then predict the behaviors. Now, the interesting thing here is our prediction models have massively changed and we have to be adaptive. They have and they haven't. We see a lot of behaviors that we're not able to predict right now. If you would have asked me now our whole area really started to focus on this like early March, right? If you would have said, Jay, can you predict the different behaviors that are going to happen because of this crisis? I would have been pretty close. I would have never predicted, and I don't know if you guys have experienced this, the United States had a run on toilet paper. Like people went out and they bought so much damn toilet paper, and it was just like this herd mentality of gotta get the toilet paper. And all of a sudden, like, there was none. There was literally, finally you can find it at a grocery store right now, but there was none. I would have never predicted that for a respiratory illness. But if you link it back and you look and you say, okay, well, why did people do that? Because the first message out was, this is just like the flu. What is one of the symptoms of having the stomach flu? Okay, now we can understand where people are. So in retrospect, it makes sense, but at the time, I would have never predicted that. So we have to think about those models of behavior. If we can explain it, then we can predict it, okay? So one of the ways that we do this is the expectancy violation theory. When we can predict a bad behavior or a negative outcome behavior from somebody else, it has less of an impact on us internally. So for example, if you've ever made the statement to somebody along the lines of, I'm going to introduce you to my family, but just be mindful, my brother is probably going to say this, and just ignore him. He doesn't mean anything by it. You are helping somebody to predict a potential bad behavior. So when it happens, it's not shocking, okay? as we walk through these scenarios with these difficult people, predicting their behavior, and that doesn't mean accepting it, that doesn't mean being okay with it, but that means predicting what's going to happen gives us that guard, gives us that, okay, I knew this was coming. The moment that you can say, I knew this was coming, you have reduced uncertainty inside of your brain. The uncertainty is what leads to anxiety. Anxiety leads to the fear leads to the limbic reactions. Predicting it can help us stop doing it, okay? Hugely important. So what are the behaviors that you can predict your challenging people are? Not muting their phones on Zoom, not showing up on time, not necessarily being considerate of everybody else inside of the meetings, not doing their assignments and blaming somebody else. Predicting those, again, not accepting them, not saying that that's a positive consequence or not even a negative consequence behavior, but predicting them makes us react less. If we can react less, then we can, okay, I understand that you missed the deadline on this. How can we work together in the future to ensure that doesn't happen again? How can we work together in the future? And again, it's a how question. So it's saying, give me a solution. Well, I don't know. Okay, well, if you did know, what might that be? Believe it or not, when we press human beings, they will give you answers. Okay, so you said today that if I were to give you a text message, and I can do that as your teammate, I can give you a text message to help remind you of the deadlines as they're coming. You're not going to find that to be too much contact, or you're not going to find that annoying because you're asking for it, right? And we're confirming you want me to behave in a way, this is what you're requesting, which means you can't get mad at me for behaving in the way that you're requesting. If we can predict it, then we can influence it. When we're starting to think about those individuals, we need to anticipate their aggressive and defensive tones. If they have labeled us in their mind an enemy or a foe or a problem person in their life, they're going to react to us in that way. We have to be able to predict that, because if we predict it, we can slow our reaction back. There's a concept in neuroscience called mirror neurons. This is actually what helps us to build different relationships with each other. We mirror other people's reactions and expressions. This is why if I raise my voice, you'd raise your voice, and I raise my voice and you raise your voice. And then all of a sudden we're screaming at each other over a cup of jelly. And we're like, well, wait, how did we get into this fight? Well, what are we even arguing about? Like, when you take that step back, if we can anticipate it, we can de-escalate it. And that's really one of the critical factors. Anticipate that they're going to give you silence, anticipate their sarcasm, anticipate their slams or their personal attacks. Yes, that is a toilet seat with tacks on it. It's to remind you that all of those things may pinch your ass, but they're not going to kill you. And you get to be the person that rises above those those things. But if you can predict them and say, I knew this was coming, I knew this behavior was going to happen, I'm not going to let it hurt me, here's how I'm going to react to it. You're almost creating the opportunity for mental recipes. If this behavior occurs, here is how I will respond. If this person says this, I will not get angry. I will manage my behavior in the following ways. So now let's look at influence and control measures. The asking questions and then listening, hugely impactful. So we go back to the explain where we're actually getting it. But one of the things, again, this comes from Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator, is active listening. So when somebody says to you, this is how he started his negotiations. The person would be on there and say, this is what we want and this is what we're doing. Okay, how did you get to where you're at today? And he would ask, and he'd have these questions, and how would you do this? How, and these how questions. But ultimately, when the person was saying, we're doing this because we believe in freedom and everything else like that, he would then reiterate their position back to them from their position. Okay, well, that makes a ton of sense. You're doing this because you've been marginalized by your government, and your government has not paid any attention to your health, your well-being, or anything else. And now you're upset because they have failed you. And all of a sudden, when he speaks their words back to them without any argument or anything else, they've been listened to and they've been heard. Hugely influential. We'll talk about that in acknowledgement as well. I or we is inclusive language. If I come up and I say, you know, every time that you give your report, you say this or you do this or you, as soon as I say you, that wall is going to come up in between the two of us because it's you and them. It's that binary, it's that label. But if I say, you know, one of the things I'm noticing is that we are having some challenges communicating with each other whenever the reports are being given. It's not you, it's we. And if you take that, it ends up having a huge impact on us, and the conflict is the them, not they as a person. Utilizing acknowledgement. This is where this gets powerful. I'm going to tell you a funny story. One of my dear friends, Dr. John Malarnick, psychologist, also works in behavior. I went through one of his programs, and it was his behavioral styles. And my behavioral style, one of mine, is control and engage. And so what that means is that when I'm in a high stress situation, I'm willing to take charge. I'm willing to engage the people. I'm willing to help. So it's a collaborative, but I'm willing to take charge type approach. Other people have disengagement or adaptability, etc. So I was paired with somebody that was literally the complete opposite of my behavioral style. And we were given a scenario, and the person was going to read, we were a husband-wife scenario. The person was going to read their situation, and then I was to respond to it. So they read their situation, and it was a really tough day today, and I had to pick up the kids, and I did this, and it was super hard, and blah, 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 and this and that and the other thing. Goes through the whole scenario. So at the end of it, I'm like, okay, listen, no worries. Tomorrow, I will pick up the kids. I'll do this. I'll help you with this. I can get the laundry done in like 10 minutes. No worries. You don't have to worry about that. And I go through this whole diatribe. And I'm thinking, like, at the end of myself, I'm giving myself a little pat on the back. I'm like, I nailed this. I'm the best communication partner ever. Like, my ego kicks in, and I'm like, yes, crushed it. We go back to the main room and ask the question, well, how did it go? And my partner raises her hand. I'm like, here it comes. Here's Jay's awesome. And the person goes, you know, I didn't really feel listened to. And I'm like, what? I heard every single thing that you said. I gave you a solution for every single one of those things. Yeah, I just didn't feel like I was heard. And I was just like I was crushed for a second. Like, how could you not? Like, I heard you and I said, here's how I can help. Here's what I'm going to do. So then it was, again, we're paired off with somebody different. And the scenario comes out. And this time I'm coached and I've said, you're not allowed to offer any solutions. All you can do is offer acknowledgement. You can say things like, I can understand how that would be frustrating. I understand how that's hard. Yeah, if I was in that position, that would be really hard for me too. Yeah, I can certainly see your frustration. I'd be frustrated with that. So I do the exercise again, and that's all I say. And a little piece of me inside is dying at this point in time because I'm wanting to let the solutions out, and a piece of me is dying. And we get done with this, and I feel like the biggest imposter. I feel like, oh God, it went even worse than the first time, and I'm just going to get crucified when I get back to the main room. So we go back to the main room, and how did this time it go, partners? And my partner raises their hand, and I'm like, well, here it comes. Jay is the best listener. Like, I felt so empowered and inspired. I threw up my hands. I'm like, I'm done with this. I don't understand this. And this was a few years back, and we sat down, and it was so powerful to me to understand that if I'm having a problem, I want solutions. Somebody, you better tell me what I need to do to get myself out of it. But that's not how all of us work. And acknowledgement, like, yep, that's a problem. That's a tough thing that you're going to have to fix. Would you like some support? May I help you in some way? That's really where we get into, I can understand your frustration. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it. Sorry. There's different ways that we can apologize. I'm sorry that you took that way. I'm sorry that you were offended. These are not really sorries. These are ways in which we probably are just going to exacerbate conflict. However, one of the ways that we can do is set our ego aside, and we can look at that and say, I'm really sorry that my communication created that experience for you. How could I do this better in the future? How could we work on that together in the future? Looking at it and saying, sometimes you have to discipline an employee. Sometimes you have to give somebody bad news. That doesn't mean that you have to change the behavior, but you can be sorry that somebody has a negative experience from that, or has a negative emotion from that, or it hurts them, or anything else. You can have that moment of compassion, still knowing that you would have had to have behaved in the same way, but saying, you know what, I'm sorry. I was hoping that we would be able to have a communication about this or further discussion. Unfortunately, I feel forced that I had to take that behavior. Maybe we can look at it and say how we could do this in the future that wouldn't necessarily hurt your feelings in the same way. And having that sort of compassion to it, even if we don't agree with it. Using flattery. Now, this does not mean be like, hey, great ass. That's going to have a different conversation. It's going to be a sexual harassment training that you have to take after that. But flattery goes a lot deeper than just the physical. And especially if you can actually validate somebody's personhood or their beliefs or their values. Say, you know, this is one of the greatest ways to do that. Find something that they did well. Find anything that they did well. And go up to that person that's difficult to you, unannounced, unscripted, and just say, you know, I know we don't always get along, but I thought your report today was brilliant. Could I get a copy of that? I would love to read a little bit further. Number one, you'll be planting this little tiny bomb in their brain, because they're not going to be sure, especially if you've been at odds with each other, they're not going to be sure. They want that to be true. They want it to be true. And then when you get the report, if they give you the report, give it back to them and be like, really, honestly, this was just absolute brilliant work. Thank you. And leave it at that. You will have planted a seed inside of their brain that changes the label of yourself. So they see you in one way, but now all of a sudden you're somebody that says, you did good. You're rewarding them. They will receive a hit of dopamine, the happy drug in the brain. And then they're going to want that dopamine again. This is the habit formation. When we get dopamine or rewarded for a behavior, we want to do that behavior again. So they will do their best to get that dopamine hit, especially if it's an enemy telling you how good you are. All of a sudden, they'll keep coming back to the water feeder to try to get that hit again. This is a powerful way to influence somebody's behavior. But it's hard because we don't want to go and give a compliment to our mortal enemy. We don't want to be flattery to our mortal enemy because, oh, they're the enemy. Everything they do sucks. Break out of that if you want to influence the other person's behavior. And take a direct approach. Really, really critical. Because when we're not taking a direct approach, if you've ever received a phone call, hey, come down to my office, and you have no idea why you just got called in, your brain doesn't immediately go, oh, I'm getting a raise. It goes, oh God, what did I screw up? How am I in trouble? What did I do? Oh my gosh. If I tell my dad, Dad, it's time we had a talk, my dad's going to think I'm trying to take his car keys away from him. Whereas it might be something like, we need to talk about, the future of your whatever, and it's not something that uncertainty drives anxiety in the other person. They're going to come in more defensive. They're going to be worried about it. They're going to be more anxious. Their limbic system is going to be up, and it's going to make it harder for you to connect with them. A direct approach. Hey, I'd love for you to come to my office. We're going to talk a little bit about X, Y, and Z. And ultimately, we're going to look for some solutions and how we can move forward from here. We're going to talk about a problem, and we're going to talk about solutions, because you're not getting fired, but here's the problem. Let's look at solutions in the future. Okay? That direct approach has a huge impact on the other person's psychology. Finally, the last, control. Two things we learned in preschool or kindergarten. Take a deep breath and count to 10. Those two strategies are actually confirmed by neuroscience. It's brilliant. When we take a deep breath, now if you're in the middle of a fight, don't be like, because they're going to look at you and be like, oh my gosh, this is not working. But, you know, if there's a moment where you're having a stressful situation and you happen to do this with your camera and just go, maybe turn the microphone off too, that's perfectly acceptable. Why? Because you're actually reducing your limbic reaction. You're reducing your threat. Thank God for microphone mute and video mute in these situations. Calm yourself and then re-engage. If you're not calm, they will feed off of that. They will see it, they will react to it, and now it's going to be more of that escalatory behavior. Step back, breathe, count to 10, and then engage. Ask yourself, what assumptions are you making? Because this is a really interesting one. So one of my very first projects with the Redford JCs was to do the Christmas shopping tour. And it's a beautiful project. You raise money, and I'll give you the short version. You raise money, and then you go out and you buy presents for different people. And at this point in time, we were actually delivering the presents to their homes. We do the first two, and the family just erupts in like tears and joy because they were not going to have a Christmas without us. And they're giving us hugs, and it was such a beautiful day, a beautiful experience. And then we go to the third house, and their house is larger than mine. There's two luxury sports cars in the driveway, and I'm looking at this like, you've got to be kidding me. Did they just dupe the system trying to get free stuff? Like, what is wrong with people? And I'm angry. I'm like literally clutching. I go and knock on the door, and Jennifer Mansfield is a police officer, and she's familiar with the term called cop knocking, where it's like, and you're just banging on the door, which I did. And I'm waiting for the person to come up so I can yell at them, and they open the door, and my entire perspective changed, because here's mom laying in a hospital bed, stage 4 cancer. They're losing their house because they had essentially stopped being able to pay it. Dad was a very successful physician who had to leave his practice in order to take care of mom and take care of the kids. They'd exhausted their savings. Their cars were being repossessed. One of them was being sold to try to pay for the medications necessary. And as soon as the door opened, the dad drops to his knees, starts crying, because one of his neighbors had actually known what was going on, but he hadn't told anyone else. We don't know what's happening behind somebody else's doors. We don't know what experiences or what they're going through. And when we take a moment and remember that we are all JCI, we're all human, regardless of boundaries, labels, or anything else, that something is creating those behaviors. Sometimes it's nature, sometimes it's nurture, but oversimplifying that and just saying, well, the person's just an asshole is not going to get us a better result. Why is it on us to get a better result? Because it's your heart attack. So that's where we need to learn to de-escalate those situations, de-escalate that aggressive tone, slow your voice down. Be mindful of how we are engaging. Are we showing that on our face? Are we doing that across Zoom? Are we interrupting somebody or dismissing somebody? What is our stake in creating that conflict? Because it didn't just happen with that person. They did something, we reacted to it, they react to it, we react to it, they react to it, we react to it. Even in politics, some of my very, very closest friends are on the opposite side of the aisle from me. And I can have those relationships because I choose not to judge their behaviors as good or bad, but as having negative consequences and positive consequences. And when we think about things in that way, it helps us to reduce our likelihood to react to situations where their beliefs, values, communication styles, behaviors, patterns are different than ours. And if none of that works, introduce a cute dog into the situation. I make a joke about that, but this is why stress balls work, because this is actually a comfort gesture. You see speakers that are nervous, they do this. That's actually a comfort gesture that reduces limbic reaction. Rubbing a dog or a stress ball can help keep us under control. So even if you have a stress ball under the table that you're like crushing to death while you're talking, that will be something that helps reduce some of that anxiety in the interaction. The last couple of things, pick your battles. Is this the hill I want to die on? Is this worth my heart attack? Sometimes the answer might be yes. And most of the time, hopefully, the answer is no. Can we just let it go? Do we need to fight every fight? Well, if it's an enemy, I feel like I have to fight every battle. But if I change that nature, that scope, this isn't the hill I want to die on, let them have it. maybe the next time they're a little more likely to let me have it. And honestly, there's a difference culturally between the way that people argue. And so that's even true inside of like our country. There are people, Jennifer Mansfield and I, we can argue with each other and yell at each other and everything else like that. We have a very similar personality type. And it'd be like, okay, I'm done. You want to go get a beer? And that's it. And there are other people that if I get into an argument like that, they will not speak to me for weeks at a time. So yes, you're absolutely right. But that's also explaining the existing behaviors, knowing some of those cultural drivers of behaviors, being able to predict how somebody's going to go. And if you may not have that battle, but the person that you're communicating with, it may be a battle to them. And that's where we have to be cognizant of it. Once you resolve a conflict, once you get it out, let it go. You have to let it go. Carrying that just gets heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier, and it just leads to more conflict. Focus on the positive. Just because somebody has bad behaviors doesn't mean that they're a bad person. Pull that label back. And really, the most important is care enough to coach. We avoid difficult conversations because they're painful. We avoid confronting these different challenges because it's painful. But look at yourself as a coach on that team, on that project, in that role. Think of yourself of how can I ask? Coaching isn't telling, it's asking. It's asking, how can we do this better? How might we be able to change this nature? How can we do this? If you think of yourself as a coach, well, now we're on the same team. And asking those questions gives them the opportunity to explore and understand it themselves. So how can you use this? We know what some of the drivers are, particularly right now. We're in high stress environment. People are undergoing, we don't know what's behind their closed doors. And maybe they were an asshole before COVID, but maybe they got worse since this situation. But we really need to take a step back and remember that it's on us to be able to manage those conflicts and those situations because it's our heart attack. It may be selfish, but I don't want to die because I'm frustrated with somebody else. I don't want somebody else to leave that maybe has talent because I can't necessarily get along with them. How can I change me in order to affect the we? And that's a really important statement. How can I change me to affect the we in a more effective way?